might get canceled for this, but you know what? It's totally fine. It's totally fine. Okay, as an American, I feel like it's my obligation to probably talk a little bit about NASCAR, and my channel name is ChevyTalksRacing, as in like all forms of racing. So this time I picked the Daytona 500, which is actually really sick. Like, I feel like everybody knows about the Daytona 500. Here are my rules for this video, okay? I'm gonna be as respectful as I can about my opinions, and I expect you to do the same. Like, you don't have to agree with me, but just be respectful about it, please. And if you're more respectful about it, I'll be more inclined to like watch more NASCAR in the future. That's that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's actually start by talking about the fact that sports commentators can talk directly to drivers. And here's what I have to say about that, right? I think in the context that NASCAR does it, it's totally acceptable. And let me explain why. NASCAR commentators don't interject when drivers have to do something that requires all of their attention. Most of the tracks aren't your typical F1 tracks where there's a lot of turns that you have to navigate. So a lot of these commentators will interject when drivers don't really have to worry about much. Like, for example, when drivers are warming up their tires at the beginning of the race. And another thing, the sports commentators will actually ask questions that are worth answering. I feel like a lot of the sports commentators in NASCAR actually do a really good job of keeping up with what's going on without a lot of the funny business that happens in F1. Like, I feel like we all have certain F1 commentators that we really enjoy, and then there are certain F1 commentators that we're really just not on the same page about. Number 2, the questionable sponsors. When I was looking at pictures of NASCAR cars, this one car came up. This is number 12. I think this is Ryan Blaney. The first thing that you see, Dent Wizard. First of all, what is that? And then I looked at a lot of the other NASCAR cars, and a lot of them have like not your average, or well, actually exactly your average everyday sponsors. You're not gonna find Rolex, all of those like high-end sponsors that you see in F1. I don't think Dent Wizard is as weird as the Kim Kardashian sponsor though. She was actually a sponsor. There's a picture for her fragrance at some point in the past, which is weird. Like, I don't think Lewis Hamilton would want to drive a Mercedes with that on it. I guess that brings me into my next point, which is how hard it actually is keeping track of cars in NASCAR. If you don't know whose number is whose and what their car looks like, you're gonna have no idea who's on what team and who's where. And I'll tell you what, all of the cars in the NASCAR grid look different from each other. I think it has to do with the fact that each driver gets like different sponsors. So you might see 2 people on a team who have completely different looking cars because they've got completely different sponsors. I think that's how it works. Correct me if I'm wrong. You might not know who the commentator is talking about, and because it's so fast paced, you might miss an overtake or something crucial. And that also kind of makes it confusing to think about how teams are run. In F1, there's 20 cars, 10 teams, 2 drivers per team, easy peasy. NASCAR, it's not like that. You've got like 43, I think, drivers. 43? 46? I don't know, something like that. Like in the 40s, and you've got like 17 teams, and each team can have up to a maximum of 4. That doesn't mean that every team has to have 4. You could have a team that's running literally 1 car, which makes calculating points kind of tough. And I'm not going to get into that because I don't even know how points in NASCAR really works yet. But here's, I guess, where it gets kind of interesting. In NASCAR, almost all of those cars are manufactured by the same 3 car manufacturers, which I think is Chevrolet, Ford, and Toyota. Meaning that you could have different teams, but those cars on those teams are made by the same car manufacturer, meaning that those cars aren't too different in terms of development, engineering, etc. That's actually something that can be really, really helpful, and I'll get into that when I talk about like the really good parts about NASCAR. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of things that are like different is the fact that the race lengths in NASCAR are much longer. In F1, you've got like 2 hours, which itself is a lot. NASCAR, sometimes you've got like 3.5, upwards of 4 hours, and it might get a little bit boring for you if you don't know what's going on because the cars are kind of just going around on a track. But it does make sense. The more you watch NASCAR races, you will understand why race lengths are such and why the track is positioned that way. Let's actually take a look at the things that are actually awesome about NASCAR, and I have to really reiterate that these things are actually really, really interesting, and I didn't appreciate it the first time around. Number 1 are the way that the NASCAR cars are made. At first glance, right, like you'll probably think, okay, well, these cars actually kind of look like the cars that I see on the road, right? And that's true to some extent. You might actually see a model of a NASCAR car on the road. The difference is the fact that the NASCAR cars are heavily altered for the NASCAR track, right? So there's no headlights, there's stickers. The best part is how those NASCAR cars are made. So the entire exterior of the car is all sheet metal that is molded, and then you have the inside, which is all pretty much steel tubes that have been reinforced to keep the strength of that car. They don't really have like the regular windows that you see in a car. I'm sure that's for aerodynamic purposes. And there's actually an article that I read which is really, really interesting and talks more about this, which I'm going to link in the description below. Cars themselves, definitely interesting. Second thing that I want to talk about, that V8. I know in F1, a lot of the older F1 fans were really, really disappointed because the newer F1 cars just don't have that sound. If it's spectacular enough on camera, I can only imagine how wonderful it is in person to hear all of that at once. Third thing that I want to talk about is bump drafting. It's when you have one car and that car's bumper is really, really close to the rear of the car in front of it, and what that does is reduce the pocket of air between them, making both those cars go faster as a unit. It has something to do with the airflow, obviously. Again, I'm not an aerodynamicist. Something that I will say, however, is that in F1, you'll see drivers avoiding that because they don't want to be in dirty air. But in NASCAR, that actually helps those cars, and I'm assuming it has to do with the fact that NASCAR cars are closed, whereas F1 cars are open, but it's again a really cool technique. You might remember how I told you that cars might have the same manufacturers but be from different teams. Sometimes what these cars will do, they'll help out those cars. You might see two cars that are from the same manufacturer but different teams doing bump drafting to help those cars move up. But yeah, like that's something that's pretty cool that you'll see. I guess the most important part of NASCAR is the fact that you'll have much more overtakes and close wheel-to-wheel racing than you might ever see in F1. And I mean that. I feel like maybe back in the day F1 might have been much more like this, like much more cutthroat. These days it's kind of, I don't want to say it's not cutthroat, but it's just not the same. Let me explain what I mean by overtakes and super, super close racing, okay? Almost all the cars always travel together, okay? And when the racing is so close, you've got your inside line and your outside line. Cars are literally super close to each other. Like anything could happen in that moment of time, okay? The best part about these overtakes, you could have a guy way at the back of the pack who, in a matter of seconds even, bump drafts his way up or calculates his way up to be in the front, okay? I've seen that happen. It's not impossible, and you can never ever underestimate certain drivers because you never know who's gonna win. I'll get into more specifically Daytona 500 and how that played out. And I think what makes NASCAR much better in that sense is the fact that I feel like NASCAR is more fair. In F1, you are almost never going to, knock on wood, catch Nicholas Latifi drive up from P20 to P1. Past all those Ferraris, past all those McLarens, past those Mercedes, okay? You're never gonna see that. In NASCAR, however, almost all of these cars are similar to some extent, okay? So you can pretty much root for anyone because you just don't know how it's gonna play out, right? You could even bet, I guess, that the underdog is gonna win, and you might just win. And I'll get into how that played out specifically at this particular Daytona 500 right after I talk about this last point, which goes hand in hand. This isn't really a positive to NASCAR. It's more like it's what makes NASCAR more cutthroat, and that is the intensity of crashes. Even though there are more cars on the track, all it takes is a matter of seconds for two cars to crash and break up the momentum, and you might have like 15 or 16 cars out at once. It's like all or nothing. You know, in F1, when you see a crash or something, it might be because one car clipped the wall and he's out. Or you might see like two cars that like, you know, had a collision or something like that, right? You're rarely gonna see like 10 cars go out at once. But in NASCAR, all bets are off the table. I'm gonna play for you guys some scenes from Daytona 500, okay? So just a bit of context, okay? This is the final lap of Daytona 500, and you've got Joey Logano up in front, who is leading the race, okay? So far, he's leading the race, final lap of Daytona. Just watch this play out.
Goes back up, Keselowski with him. McDowell in tow, Dillon on the bottom.
The runs on top. Oh! Teammates.
Around they go in a hard crash. Kyle Busch.
Larson.
Caution is out.
Bubba Wallace is in this. Austin Cindric.
Okay, that was the last lap of the Daytona 500. Okay, now let me show you guys even up close
Michael McDowell
Again,
from
Joey
Glendale,
Logano in front.
Arizona, for Bob Jenkins Front Row Motorsports, has won the Daytona 500. How about that?
Man, that's a huge win for Michael McDowell and that team. Doesn't get any bigger.
So here's what happened. Joey Logano, guy in the front who was supposed to win that, crashed out last lap of the Daytona 500. The guy who won, Michael McDowell, nobody was expecting that, okay? Kind of an underdog moment, like Pierre at Monza last year. And I think that's one of those things that makes NASCAR much more exciting, because you can have instances like that where you've just got a massive crash. But on that note, does that mean one of these leagues is better than the other? Absolutely not, okay? It depends on your tastes, what you're into, what you like to see. I think it's definitely good to get an idea of different forms of motorsport, because then, you know, you're kind of broadening your perspective a bit. I definitely think that from where my stance was in the past on NASCAR, it's definitely changed now. I definitely think it's much more interesting now than I did like a couple months ago. If you guys have any recommendations for any NASCAR races that you think I should watch, do let me know. Please let me know what else you would like to see me do in the future. As always, I am on Twitter and Instagram as ChevyTalksRacing. I also make music. If you're into that, links in the description. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Or not. So.